Well, I think your dad's on strike today,
I know.
ChayaLeah.
I'm so glad we finally got rid of him.
Yeah,
This was brilliant.
yeah. It's
Brilliant maneuvering.
we'll see what the audience thinks. We'll see
They're
if
gonna
people
love
learn.
it.
Yes, yes. Well, I know you will.
I know. This is my time to shine in
That's
this
right.
season, actually. No. We're trying something new, and we're both excited to do this. My dad couldn't be here today, otherwise he would have. But he he has a day job, unlike us. We just sit around doing nothing and thinking of ideas
We
to
slave
talk about.
away for our audience, just coming up with new
Exactly.
topics to talk about constantly. So
Exactly.
yeah,
So we're doing a little we're doing an interview actually, which I'm excited about. Some of you may know that I have another podcast where I do regular interviews. So maybe we're bringing some of Ask a Jew to education, and I'm excited to do that. And we have I'll let Jay introduce our guest because he has like a lot to say, and I'm excited to hear about it.
I I often have a lot to say. Not that
I know.
not that's worth anything, but I have
Not
a
that
lot
we
to
get a
say in this.
chance. Not that
Um,
we get much of a chance with my
yeah,
dad.
yeah, that's a good point.
So go for it.
We're gonna get all out now. Um,
Yeah.
so you might remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about a article in the New York Post about a Lieutenant Nathan Baskind, who was a World War II soldier who was lost behind enemy lines and was MIA until just a couple of years ago. His body was discovered in a mass grave with several dozen Nazis, and an organization called Project Benjamin was responsible for working with the German government and working with the various religious authorities to exhume his body and give him a proper Jewish burial. And after reading that article, I started to do some more research on Project Benjamin, and I was really blown away by the work. It's really fascinating, and so I reached out to Shalom Lamm, who is the co-founder, CEO, and chief historian of the organization, to have a little discussion with us about Lieutenant Baskind and Project Benjamin overall. So
It's great
welcome
to
to the
be here.
show. Yeah, welcome to the
Dave,
show.
thank you for that introduction, and ChayaLeah, thank you for introducing Jay. So I've thanked everybody.
Yeah,
Yes,
you got it covered.
exactly.
You got it covered. So you know, like I said, I read this article. We talked about it quite a bit on the episode. ChayaLeah's dad was talking a little bit about some of the religious considerations that had to be considered in the reburial of Lieutenant Baskind. And so we'll get into that story in a little bit, because I think that story unto itself is fascinating. But before we get into that, could you just talk a little bit about your personal background?
Sure. I spent most of my life as a businessman, but my heart was in American military history. And in 2001, with a career going and 5 kids, I finally had read enough that I said, you know what, I ought to go for an advanced degree because I had nothing else going on in my life. And I went and applied to and was accepted to a place called American Military University, which is there mostly to service career officers. Part of their advancement is by getting graduate degrees, but it's very hard to do that when you're constantly moving from place to place around the world, as soldiers do. And so this is a place meant for them. In my cohort, I think there were 70 people, if I remember correctly. This is quite a few years ago, and Shalom Lamm. And I felt a little bit out of place, but was quickly fell in love with the subject matter, with the professors, with fellow students. My area of concentration was the American Civil War, but I always had a fascination with World War II. And then when this opportunity presented itself, I literally retired and said, "This is it. This is what I'm doing." And it's
Wow.
been the most rewarding thing I've done in my life, and it should only continue. It's spectacular.
So you're saying in your class there weren't a lot of Shlomo Goldmans or
There were not. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. There was when you start, you need to be introduced to your main professor who's going to be teaching your first course on military methods of military history, I think it was called. This is already back in quite a few years ago. And his name was Professor White. I forgot his first name. But he had two PhDs, one in German military history and one in the structure, I believe, of the German war cabinet in World War I, something along those
Oh my
lines.
God.
But it was German, 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 German. And his name is Professor White, and he's the head of the chief historian for the Armor Corps of the United States Army. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is not going to go well. So I remember pacing up and down, going, "Should I really be doing this?" And I get on the phone, and there's a scripted things. Hi, Professor White. This is Shalom Lamm, student number so and so and so and so. And I'm expecting terrible things to come out of this guy's mouth. And the first thing he says is Jewish, eh? And I said,
Oh
"Oh
my
my
God.
God, this is crazy." And then
Getting
I
off on the
said,
right foot.
"Getting off the right foot." I said, "Yes, sir, I am Jewish." He goes, "Well, why don't you guys nuke those blankety blank?" And he talked about all the enemies of Israel.
Oh
And
my
I said,
God.
"Oh boy, you couldn't make this up." So, but we ended up becoming very close. I took 6 courses with him. He was a
Wow.
brilliant historian, brilliant historian. I learned the world from him, became very close friends,
Oh
and
my
it was a
God.
magnificent experience. It took me 4 years. ChayaLeah, I know you're in
Worth it.
graduate school. You know what it's like, but it was great.
It's
It
so
was really
hard.
life altering. It was wonderful.
That's
It
awesome.
So
really
wait,
was
That's
before
wonderful.
we,
awesome.
so I want to just ask you a question about Civil War history. Did you get to do any work on like Jewish officers or, the
I
Jewish
did.
story of the Civil War?
I did. I've actually been in a number of films about Jews in the
Oh,
Civil War, on air historian. But my thesis was on a fascinating speech given by a rabbi in New York on the eve of the Civil War, Morris J. Rafel, and he was a
wow.
tremendous Torah scholar, and he gave a rousing speech in defense of slavery on the eve of the Civil War. This is not what
You're kidding.
President Lincoln intended by saying that preachers should be preaching about unity in their houses of worship. And it was the front page of the New York Herald Record the next day, and it was fascinating. And the response to him in the New York Herald Record, I think it was called, was by a Reform Rabbi David Einhorn
Mm,
from Baltimore, and his response created such a stir that he was actually almost lynched in Baltimore and had
wow.
to escape, had to run for his life, and never returned.
Wow.
And what I did as my thesis was an analysis of the biblical sources used by Raphael and why he was so utterly and absolutely wrong. And the mystery was he was a brilliant man. He knew the sources better than I did.
Right.
So how could he have said these things? And I tried to analyze why he did this. And I thought it was to protect the Jewish people because remember,
Mm,
everybody likes to forget this. The status quo ante of the Civil War was that slavery was part of history for 5,000 years.
mm,
It was abolitionism, thank God, but that was what was new, and that's
mm.
what was different. And new and different doesn't always help the Jewish people.
Hmm.
And so that was my
Fascinating.
thesis. I'm not sure if I was right or was wrong, but it was great fun doing it.
Wow, that's
Well,
fascinating.
all I can say is thank God ChayaLeah's dad is not here because I think this podcast would probably turn into that discussion and not about Project Benjamin. So
Agreed.
so it was
Agreed.
fortuitous that,
Fascinating.
that he couldn't make
That's
this.
great. That's super interesting.
That sounds fascinating. That's great. So could you give us a little background about the origins of Project Benjamin and how you became involved in that
Sure.
organization?
To make a small correction, it's Operation Benjamin.
Oh, I'm
Everybody calls it
sorry.
Project Benjamin. One day we'll
Okay.
probably change the name because everybody calls it Project Benjamin, but
Okay.
it's Operation Benjamin, and it's named after a soldier who is buried at the Normandy American Cemetery, and his name is Benjamin Garadetsky. Benjamin
Mm,
Garadetsky served for 3 years in combat as a combat medic and was killed in a German Air Force raid 3 years into his war experience. He was born, his family, and he, in fact, were born in Ukraine. They moved to the Bronx. And why were we interested in him? So it all starts with my co founder. I have two co founders, Steve Lamar from Washington, D.C., and Rabbi Jacob J. Schachter at Yeshiva University. And Rabbi Schachter, who I know ChayaLeah, I'm sure you know,
mhm.
he is a medieval historian, a great Jewish scholar, and he was leading a tour for a small group through the Normandy area around the 70th anniversary of Normandy in 2014. And what do Americans do when you're near Normandy? You go and visit the Normandy American Cemetery. It's an amazing, hallowed, holy, incredible area. His father was a very, very well-known, very famous Jewish chaplain in World War II. He was one of the liberators of Buchenwald. So he has Rabbi
Hmm.
Shack had a real affinity for um, uh, American soldiers, Jewish soldiers in World War II. So he went and visited, and he looked around, and something bothered him. I saw him 3 weeks later. I've known him for decades, and saw him 3 weeks later at a party for a friend of ours whose daughter got engaged. And he said, "Listen, Shalom, I just got back from Normandy. It is holy, hallowed ground. I cried. It was amazing, but I thought there would have been more Jewish stars."
Mm.
That's all he said. And the thought had never occurred to me before. I just had no idea. So I quickly it was a Saturday night. I ran back home, got on the internet, and I found out there were 9,380 or so American soldiers buried there. I knew just as a historian that 2.71% of U.S. casualties were Jews. Quick math, about 235 or so Jewish soldiers should be buried there. How many were buried? No idea. So I literally sat and counted photographs,
Wow.
and there were 149.
Oh, wow.
Where are the missing Jews? So we kicked around lots of ideas for weeks. We kicked around ideas. All of them were totally wrong. But, we tried to think the problem through. And slowly but surely, one thing led to another. We said, let's take an experiment. Let's get a Jewish sounding name and see what happens. And we picked, wouldn't you know it, Benjamin Garodetsky. God was looking over our shoulder.
Oh my gosh.
Um, a good friend of ours who my son later married his daughter, so he's my mechutin. Steve
That's
Lamar
neat.
was a very good amateur genealogist, and we worked together, meaning he worked and I approved of the genealogy of Benjamin Garodetsky. And wouldn't you know it, his parents are buried 10 minutes from our house on Long Island. So I
Wow.
went on a hot date with my wife to see, are his parents Jewish? And we went, and it was amazing. It's a totally Jewish cemetery, which I've gotten to know very well. Beth David Cemetery in Elmont, New York. It's a
Mm.
huge Jewish cemetery. And there was his sister who predeceased him, and there were his parents, and everybody's buried in a Jewish cemetery. So what's Garodetsky doing buried under a cross? And one
Wow.
thing led to another, and we figured out how that happened. So the federal agency that runs America's foreign cemeteries, Normandy American Cemetery, Manila American Cemetery, Luxembourg American Cemetery, all these cemeteries is the American Battle Monuments Commission, the ABMC. So we did what any good, dutiful American would do. We called the ABMC and say, "Hey, we found a mistake. This is amazing. Like there's never been a mistake before." And it didn't go well. It wasn't a really good call. It
They didn't
wasn't.
care.
Yeah, I want to tell you the end of the story is we now have a spectacular relationship with them. They are
Mm.
great people. They truly, truly, truly care. But we've discovered over time that when you deal with cemeteries, crazy people call you aside from
Right.
people who really have an interest.
Mm,
And they just assumed we were crazy people.
mm.
But when we sent them our research, they could not have been better, more inviting. And they basically
Wow.
gave us a roadmap and said, listen, these are very, very, very hard to change. The bar is very high. Something now that we're very experienced at this, we agree it should be very high.
Mm.
And you need to prove that a person was Jewish with contemporaneous original material. You can have a lot of supporting material, but you must have
Wow.
that original material. So it's a very high bar. And the second thing is we have no standing. We can't make this request. We also agree with that policy. It has to be the closest living relative.
Oh.
Go find the closest living relative. Very few of these guys had children. So now you're dealing with nieces and nephews.
Oh,
Go
geez.
find a woman who no longer has her maiden name, who's now moved all over the country, maybe is divorced. But it is really a challenge.
Wow.
But I say that not with any bitterness. I say quite the contrary. It should be difficult to change these, otherwise it
Right.
becomes crazy. But thank God it's been amazing. It took us about 2 years to get Garodetsky done, to get that changed. But I want to tell you the end of the story. Now we're averaging about 45 days once our research is completed.
You're kidding.
Yeah. So I
45
mean,
days.
yeah. So the ABMC now knows how we
Right.
work.
There's a
We know what
process.
they need.
Right.
There's a process. It's a very thorough process, and they know that if there's a problem with a soldier, we're going to highlight it.
Wow.
We're going to say, here's the issue. Let's deal with this. And it's been just an incredible experience. I, they're an agency of the U.S. government that functions beautifully. And I say the people who work there, they don't have a job; they have a calling, and we've been totally embraced by them, and that
Wow.
embrace is mutual.
So did you start off by like looking for Jewish names? I mean, after you did his, did you then go through like sift through the almost 10,000 names looking, or did you put out a call and say like, do you have a relative that may have been killed? You know, how did it go from there?
It started with names. It started
Okay.
with looking for names. Although I will tell you, there was our first one. I'll tell you a really cool. So one of the nice things about this job I have is I have a lot of stories. So I'll tell you a really cool story. And it didn't. It wasn't a good story. It was a bad story. Um, a wonderful rabbi who's now in Memphis, Tennessee, Akiva Males, wrote a great story, a great article in a journal called Yakira about his father's dog tags in World War II, whether they had an H on them for Hebrew or a P for Protestant. Many, 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 many Jewish soldiers put a P or a C for Catholic on their dog tags in case they were captured. They didn't
Right.
want to be identified as Jews. It was a self-preservation thing. It's a smart thing to do. No one has a problem with it. Although people did feel bad about doing that, but it
Right.
certainly made a lot of sense. And unfortunately, we know from history that was a smart thing to do because Jews were often separated from their comrades and treated horribly by the Germans, very different than other American soldiers. And there are many, many important stories about that. Many heroic non Jewish guys who stood
Right.
up for their Jewish soldiers, and of course, many Jewish soldiers. Um, Having said that, of course, I've got where I'm going with. Oh, story, right? Uh, there is a woman in an old age home in Jerusalem
Mm.
who reads this article and contacts Rabbi Males and says, "Hey, I grew up with a guy who's buried in Italy under a Latin cross, and his name is Benzion Bernstein.
Wow.
Corporal Benzion Bernstein is buried under a cross. I mean, you see that picture, your heart just gets torn out of your chest.
Yeah.
You say, how could this be? And it's even worse. He made Aliyah in 1938 and came back to fight the Germans. And wouldn't you know it, it's he's buried under a cross. So we said, wow, this one's a no-brainer, right? And this happened even before Garadetsky. We said, wow, this is an incredible story. So we contacted the family, and we were able to find the family through some wonderful coincidences. And the family basically said to us, well, yeah, we know he's buried under a cross. It's a real tragedy. He had a fight with his father, and before he went off to war, and he said, if I get killed, I want to be buried under a cross to spite you.
Oh no.
And if a
Hmm.
soldier says that, that's the end. There's nothing you can do
Oh.
about that. It was this tragic, terrible, horrible story, and it was very humbling as a historian because we could never have known that, right?
Right.
We can do all sorts of proofs that he's Jewish, but that's something we could have known. And a 28-year-old kid makes a statement like that in the heat of passion, and a terrible tragedy ensues. And it's heartbreaking, right? Everybody feel terrible.
I
Let
feel
me tell you the
terrible.
good. Now let me
Mhm.
tell you the end of the story.
Okay, good.
So that
Hope
was
there's a
8 years.
happy ending.
That was 8 years ago. Okay, we didn't know anything at that time. Well, since then we've done 27 headstone replacements. We've done this 27
Wow.
times, and we've seen a lot of things. So in 2018 or 19, probably 2019, we're in Manila changing 5 headstones. Manila American Cemetery, largest American cemetery outside the
Wow.
United States. 17,000 some odd soldiers are buried there, and there are 36,000 soldiers on the wall of the missing. 36,000
Wow.
soldiers never been recovered. It's a very tragic place, very
Wow.
beautiful place, lots of dignity, but very tragic. Fine, there's a soldier named Alan Chase Franken, and his uncle is a Reform rabbi, and he is speaking. John Franken is a wonderful man, and he's speaking, and he says something that made my head explode. He said, "You were brought up in a strong Reform family, and we could never understand why you wanted to be buried under a cross. It tortured us for years. And then Operation Benjamin came along, and we did all this research, and we knew why he was buried under a cross because he had a P on his dog tag, self preservation. He wasn't a Protestant. He
Oh
was Protestant
no.
like I'm an astronaut,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
So we pointed out to the family. Now, the family had made up this self preservation lore
Oh.
that he must have met a Christian pastor and under combat conditions. None of that
Right.
ever happened. We know it didn't happen because none of his letters ever talked about it. The letters home, nothing in his military files reflected it. Nothing in the chaplain's files reflected it. It
Wow.
never happened. It was just a clerical error.
Hmm.
Oh. Wow.
All of a sudden, boom! Who said the story about Benzion Bernstein was true? So just
Right.
this year, we reopened that file, and we went through his file with a fine-tooth comb. There is no record of him ever making a request to be buried under a cross. Never happened, never existed. So we went to the family
Oh my
and we
God.
said, we don't believe this story. I mean, basically a challenge. These are lovely, sweet, delicious people. But we challenged them. We don't believe your story, and here's why. And they said, well, we have letters here that show the conflict with the son and his parents. I said, can I see those letters? They said, well, do you speak Yiddish? I said, well, I can. I don't speak Yiddish, but Rabbi Schachter does. I'll read them with him.
Right.
So I said, do you guys speak Yiddish? No, but these are the letters that talk about the arguments. So they sent me the letters, which was so sweet of them. These letters were loving letters between a devoted son and his wonderful parents.
Oh
There was
my
no
gosh.
conflict at all. The whole thing was a defense mechanism because in those days the government couldn't have made a mistake. Something else must have happened. And guess what?
Wow.
We're changing his headstone on May 13th in Italy in
Wow.
2025.
I
So
think
That's
it's
I
really
amazing.
think we need to
exciting.
be there. I think we need a field trip.
Oh
Which
yeah,
part of Italy?
absolutely.
Yes.
It's going to be Rome Sicily American
Okay,
Cemetery.
we'll be there. No, I'm
And
just kidding.
it's he was
That's
a very
beautiful.
very heroic soldier. He was a wonderful guy.
That
Went in
is
Aliyah, early. I mean, it's an amazing story, and it's
Mm.
all because we started getting experience on what
right.
families did when sons were buried under crosses, and through that
Wow.
experience, we were able to say, "Hold it, that story doesn't hold water," and we were able to prove it, find out why he was buried under a cross, and we'll correct it with his family. They're all coming. We'll correct it
Oh my
in
God.
May.
I'm so
It's pretty
happy that was a
exciting.
happy ending. Okay, good.
Yeah, because the
Yeah.
beginning was
Yeah.
terrible. The
How,
beginning was
so
awful.
in these, so you brought up a good point that, I mean, obviously many of these soldiers who died weren't old enough to actually have any children. So you're kind of dealing with, I assume in a lot of cases, sort of extended family. How
Lots of nieces
often,
and great nieces.
how often when you reach out to these people, do they even know these people existed in the first place?
It's a
Mm.
great question. So take what we've all heard or all seen or have experienced ourselves, children of Holocaust survivors. Most of the time, there are definitely very important exceptions. Most of the time, it's too painful for the parents to talk about it, the
That's
people who
right.
are actually in the Holocaust, and they never get around to revealing it, and they die and take all of those family secrets with them. So they may have mentioned an uncle or a brother Yossi who was killed in Auschwitz. I'm making this up,
Mm-hmm.
but tell me about Yossi. And then mom starts to cry. Kid says, I don't want mom to cry. That's terrible. It's so hurtful. And never asks again.
My
And they go to the grave
grandfather,
taking it.
my grandfather had a child before the Holocaust. He was married and had a child. He never, ever, ever spoke about her.
Too
And until my
painful.
father found a picture, he was like, "Who's this person?" And it was only his mother who told him, like, "Oh, by the way, that's your sister." I mean, it was my father's sister that he
Right.
didn't know existed because she was killed
Hmm.
in the war. My grandfather never talked about it.
So now take that and
Yeah.
extend that to people who had sons killed in the war,
Right.
right?
Right.
You have a son who's this strapping. Let's say I'll give you an example. He's a B-17 pilot. I mean, B-17 pilots were
Mm,
like these were heroic, smart navigators. All these guys were really had great lives ahead of them, and they were gone in an instant. And the stories are so tragic that most of the time, not all the time, most of the time parents did not transmit anything about these kids. But because of the research that we're required to do, we know everything about these guys. We know what sports they played in high school. We know
Hmm.
who the rabbi was who bar mitzvahed them. We know, if they did get married, who they married. We know who they were dating, who they were engaged to. I mean, we know so much about these guys, and we teach these families about their own ancestors. And it's
wow.
a real coming together moment. Very often, I shouldn't say very often, but it's not infrequent that we'll get two or three strands of a family tree that the others have no idea the other strand exists.
Huh.
And we'll join them together and
That's so
introduce them to each other. We just
beautiful.
did it 2 weeks ago to a
Wow.
family, a wonderful, wonderful family, really great people. Also, have a soldier in Italy who will be changing cross in May, and it's really a
Hmm.
tremendous
Yeah.
privilege.
I
It's a
have a
great
question
byproduct of what we
that's
do.
amazing. It's just beautiful. I have a
Absolutely.
question about it's kind of a halachic question, a Jewish law. I don't know if you feel that you can answer this, but if somebody says that they want to be cremated or buried under a cross or whatever, they say it before they die. Is there halachically, do you have to follow that? Or, I mean, is there a way for a family to say, like, yeah, they said they want to be cremated, but we want to bury them properly the way, according to Jewish law? How does
So
that work?
I'm not qualified to answer, so I won't answer on the air. But if we're not on the air, just everybody stop listening.
Yeah,
Um, you,
exactly.
you don't have to follow somebody who commits to doing a sin.
Okay.
But
Okay.
it's a very, very, very touchy and difficult
Yeah.
subject.
Yeah.
Sometimes the spouse is not in on this. It's very, very difficult.
Right.
But I will tell you, in our case, if a soldier made a written request, we've never seen it, but if a Jewish soldier made a written request to be buried under a cross,
Right.
we would not change it.
You would leave it. Okay.
Yeah,
Interesting.
we're not qualified to go back in history and
Right.
see
Yeah.
what happened.
Right.
And to be honest with you, there's a rule of PNOK, the primary next of kin. So if a wife were to make that decision, and that's in writing, there's nothing we can do about that. So
Oh,
that
interesting.
story is over.
So do you? So it's interesting that one of the ways you find these soldiers is just very simply going through lists of names and seeing if their name sounds Jewish. So do you have a list, sort of like a to-do list, if you will, of names that you want to get to over time, or how do you
So
create that list of who's next up to figure these things out for?
So I didn't want to imply that is the most efficient way of doing things. It's fraught with problems. So let me give you two
Sure.
examples of how it's fraught with problems. And I'll just stay, just for now, in the Normandy American Cemetery because it's the most famous one, but we've done headstone replacements in many, many ones, many different cemeteries, and they're all gorgeous. Mendel Jacobson is buried under a cross.
Wow.
And Mendel Jacobson should be buried under a cross.
Really?
He's Christian. His
Wow.
father was Jewish. His mother was Irish Catholic, if I'm not mistaken. And the entire family were practicing Christians. They were all buried in Christian cemeteries. They all married non-Jews, and he is appropriately buried. Mendel Jacobson
That's
is
crazy.
appropriately buried under a cross.
It's
I
such
know
a
this
Chabad
because
name.
it's such a Chabad name. It's unbelievable. But we get this question to our website
Right.
all the time. Do you know? Right?
Right.
So when we get a do you know, it's one of two do you knows. It's do you know that Mendel Jacobson is buried under a cross? Or do you know that Maurice Rose, the greatest Jewish general, is buried in Groton, Netherlands under a cross? That's a mistake that needs to be corrected.
Oh.
That's an ongoing project. It's a very difficult project. We're working on that now for almost 4 years.
Wow.
So that's a separate project. But let me give you another example. Also in the Normandy American Cemetery, John Doherty, can't get more Irish Catholic than that, is buried under a Magen David. And he should be buried under Magen David. He was a practicing Jew, had a bar mitzvah, was a proud Jewish kid, but his father was an Irish Catholic, his mother was Jewish, and the father raised this kid Jewish, and he was Jewish. So the name game is fraught with all sorts of problems.
Sure.
It's not the best way to find a Jewish soldier, although we do employ that method all the time. It involves a lot of research. The absolute best way to do it, almost foolproof, is every community after the war, because people are so proud of the soldiers who gave their lives in their community. So there's Lutherans killed in the war, Catholics killed in the war, Protestants killed in the war, Jews killed in the war, you name it, Masons killed in the war. If you find someone who appears on two lists, it is almost 100% certainty you have found a Jewish soldier.
Wow.
And the reason is simple, because he was a Jewish soldier who declared another faith in order to protect himself in case of capture.
Right.
It never worked the other way. No Catholic kid would go into battle going, man, I'm going to be a Hebrew this week.
Right.
That's really a smart thing to do. That's insane. So it never worked the other way. So it's almost always you find a Jew that way. And that's been very, very successfully employed by us.
That's great.
I'm going to use this because we have the same issue on campus. It used to be easy in the olden days, long time, even before I was born. But like you would come to a new place, you would look at the phone book, Cohens, Greenbergs, you assume that they were all Jewish. Now it's not, it doesn't mean anything anymore.
Yeah.
The last names and many names that you wouldn't assume are Jewish are Jewish. And
Right.
so we need new methods of
New databases.
identifying. Yeah. We need new ways to identify the Jews.
So I'm sure there's a lot of variation here, but just sort of as a rule of thumb, from the time you start off on one of these projects to the time that you can actually bring your findings to the organization to state your case, how long does that typically take?
So there's a lot of variation. There's no typical. Depends how good the file is. It depends if there are complications. There's sometimes really fascinating complications. Um, but if it's a really straightforward case, it'll probably take us, and if the family cooperates, that's another thing.
Mm.
Sometimes a family, we'll reach out to a family and they won't want to talk to us for a year. That certainly has happened recently. But let's say your standard, really good case, it probably takes us about 3 to 4 months to do all the research, to put it in the proper package, to have the family totally on board, make sure there are no other relatives. We're very, very careful about getting all the proper relatives. And then we submit to the ABMC, and depending where we are in our timeline, in other words, so 3 years ago it would have taken 6 months. Now, once we submit, it takes about 45 days or so, and we have an approval, and
Wow.
it's really exciting. It's an amazing
That's
thing
so
when that
good.
happens.
That's so
And I
cool.
That's
want to
great.
tell you, and I think this is like a huge compliment to the ABMC. They're as excited as we are.
Mm,
They want to get it right,
right.
right?
Right.
And by the
Mm.
way, very often people will submit to us, hey, do you know, I'm making up a name, it's not a real name, Roger Cohn at the, I don't know, at the Lorraine American Cemetery is Jewish, and here's why I think he's Jewish. And we'll do the research and figure out that, no, he's not Jewish.
Right.
And we can see why they thought that, but we'll prove to them he's not Jewish. But the letter that goes out always says, we're pleased to tell you that he is properly and nobly buried under a Latin cross appropriate for that person. Because
Wow.
it's
Mm.
true. It's appropriate. It's noble. These we call it the silent civil sentinel that stands guard over these soldiers. And if
Wow.
it's appropriate, that's great. That's great.
Are there any other choices besides a cross and a Mug and David? Are there like,
Only there are today in the Veteran Administration cemeteries in the United States. That's where
uh-huh,
soldiers get buried today. But in World War II and World War One, which were the overseas cemeteries, your two choices: cross or a Star of David.
cross or star? Interesting. Wow. So too bad
So
if you were a Muslim.
Well, the theory was that if you were a Muslim, you accepted the divinity of the Old Testament and the New
Uh,
Testament, so a cross
interesting.
was not offensive to you,
Oh,
and
okay.
so it defaulted cross, and that was actually the reason.
okay.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool.
So let's talk about Lieutenant Baskind.
Yep.
So like I mentioned, we had talked about this New York Post article from a few months ago. Could you talk a little bit about the story and how you became involved? There's reading the article. There were so many twists and turns to the story. It was almost like a CSI Normandy kind of case. But could you talk a little bit about just sort of give an overview of that case?
Yeah. So, it would take hours to do it because there were so many twists and turns. And at the end of the day, I want to be really clear: it shouldn't have happened. We shouldn't have been successful. From my little non-Hasidic perspective, I'm a complete rationalist. I will tell you the hand of God was all over this. And it was a
I
beautiful
love
thing to
it.
see. And so many times where this really, really should have fallen apart, something would happen and we would continue. It was just extraordinary. It almost got to the point where you just had to shake your head and said, this is just unbelievable. So we did the first lucky break is we got an email. We got an email from a guy who's a wonderful person. He's a genealogist, an excellent genealogist in New Jersey. His name is Eric Feinstein, and he's been friends with us. It's a small community of people who focus on these things, and his expertise is World War One German cemeteries. Someone needs to be an expert in it, and he's the man. So he was looking online at the German War Cemetery, German War Graves Commission website, and he saw the name Nathan. Nathan is not a typically German name. Baskin could be anything, but Nathan is not a German name. And it just caught his eye. He looked at it and said, wow, that's strange. There's a notation for a Nathan Baskin in a German war cemetery in France, the Marigny German War Cemetery. He did some quick research and discovered that his parents were Abe and Lena and that he was Jewish. No idea if he was buried there or if it was just a notation on a wall or whatever it was. Had no idea. And he sent me an email, as we are wont to do to each other. And he said, hey, you guys should check this out. That's how this started. So I immediately went to one of our databases and found out in about 30 seconds that there's no great research here. I'm trying to downplay my end of this because it didn't take great research, if you know what you're looking for. That he was missing the Battle of Cherbourg on June 23rd, 1944. He landed on D-Day. He was a Utah Beach D-Day soldier, which in itself is a huge big deal. Took a right turn, goes to Cherbourg with the rest of the army, and 17 days after D-Day, he's killed in action. But before he's killed, he's taken as a prisoner of war by the Germans, and he dies in a German field hospital. Um, uh, so as soon as I saw that he's been missing since 1944, I said, "What do we do with this?" I reached out to our senior genealogist, who is just a brilliant woman named Rachel Silverman, and I said, "Rachel, something obviously is wrong here. So where's the mistake? Something is obviously wrong." And she writes to the German War Graves Commission in Berlin, and they are wonderful, and they write back immediately with a whole lot of information. And it turns out that they believe there's circumstantial evidence that Nathan Baskind indeed is buried not only in a German war cemetery, but in a mass grave in a German war cemetery, in a grave with 52 soldiers. And the way that we ultimately discovered how that came about. But then you come to all sorts of issues. So we figured, wow, we got to rescue this guy.
Can I ask one question about that?
Sure.
So I think the first thing that struck me in the article as almost a miracle was a Jew was buried in a mass grave with Nazis, and it was documented. Why? And
Yeah.
you may not know the answer to this, but why was this name documented as a Jew buried with a bunch of Nazis? Why would they make note of that?
It wasn't. He wasn't documented by the Germans as a Jew buried with the Nazis. Happens to be he had an H on his dog tag, but he was not noted by them as being Jewish. He was noted as being an American officer with the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion. And he was a second lieutenant. We now say first lieutenant. That was a posthumous promotion. He was in the war. He was second lieutenant. Nathan B. Baskind. So they didn't have any notation anywhere that he was Jewish. And in fact, you'll see how that's part of the story. So we sat down and said, guys, this is a horror show. These guys buried with the enemy soldiers. And whether they were Nazis or just Wehrmacht soldiers, there is a very important distinction. But either way, this is the enemy, and this was horrible. So it tore at my neshama, it tore at my soul, and we tried to figure what to do. But we figured, who would care? Who in the world would care other than us? And there's not only would we be digging up a German cemetery, it's a German cemetery in France. I mean, it gets as complicated as you can get. So really, we should have quit and just said this couldn't happen. So, but we figured there is one person in the world who actually might get this and is in a position to do something. We made an appointment to meet with the German ambassador to Israel.
Oh,
who is an amazing person. He is a wonderful man. His former TV newscaster became an ambassador. And I think he really loves the Jewish people and loves the state of Israel. I don't always agree with his politics, but he really is a very special, very fine man. How do you get an appointment with the Israeli ambassador to Germany? Guess what? Here's another coincidence. The German army, for the first time in 75 years, has a Jewish chaplain. And he's a student of Rabbi Schechter.
Oh my gosh.
Right? So Rabbi Schechter calls Chaplain Jolt Bala of the German Federal Republic Army, and he arranges a meeting for us at the German embassy in Tel Aviv. Wow. And I'll just tell you a cute little story, but I can go on for hours, and I know this is not that long a podcast for good reasons. But we go to the German embassy, and I'm there with Rabbi Schechter, and we're feeling a little out of sorts, but we are very, very well prepared with a good presentation. And we're waiting in the lobby. We announce ourselves, and out comes from behind this huge security, out comes this 6'32", blonde-haired, blue-eyed, rail-thin Lieutenant Colonel German Air Force officer. And we both looked at each other and said, what the hell are we doing here? I mean, really, right? The guy puts out his hand and proceeds to speak to us in perfect Hebrew for 20 minutes.
Wow. Amazing.
He was unbelievable. I mean, the guy was so impressive. And he was very open with us. He says, I know my history. I know why I'm here. I love this place. And my job is to protect the Jewish people. I mean, he said it outright. It was absolutely spectacular. There's so much to learn from a lot of these guys. They really have a lot to teach us. Anyway, he brought us up to the ambassador. We spoke for 20 minutes, and he brought us into the ambassador. The ambassador also speaks to us in Hebrew, which is unbelievable. We're having this great conversation. We do a PowerPoint presentation about Operation Benjamin, and about 20 minutes later, we transitioned to the story of Nathan Baskind. And the ambassador, in 5 seconds, got it. And he said, hold it. He said, the 80th anniversary of D-Day is June 6, 2024. Could we possibly find this soldier and have the German military and the German government return this Jewish boy to America and to his family? This is what the German ambassador said to us. We've come a long way in 80 years.
Wow.
And it was a very emotional moment. And we said that would be unbelievable. And then he turns to Lieutenant Colonel. I don't speak any German, but this German I understood. He said to the Lieutenant Colonel, so who in Germany deals with this? Right? Now that he got it, he needs to know who deals with this. And the guy said it's the German War Graves Commission, and it's Brigadier General Dirk Bakken. Dirk Bakken, I will tell you, is one of the Hasidei Umos HaOlam. He is one of the most amazing men I have ever had the privilege in my life to meet.
Wow.
And he says, I'm going to call General Bakken. Fine. We go away. We're thinking, oh my God, this is, wow, how did this happen? This is great. And then we don't hear from anybody for about 6 weeks. And then about 6 weeks later, a letter comes from General Bakken. And the letter starts as follows. Forgive me for the Hebrew. Dear Rabbi Schachter, L'chvod Harav. This is a German brigadier general who took the time to figure out how in Hebrew to address a prominent rabbi. This is the kind of guy he is.
Wow.
And then he proceeded to write an elegant letter about why he couldn't help us.
Oh.
And it was brilliant. It was reasoned, it was well thought out, and I'll never forget the words, it's a bridge too far. How can you disturb the rest of 51 other soldiers for the sake of one soldier? They're all human beings. They're all children of God. It was a beautiful, beautiful, elegant letter. So we wrote back and forth, and he's an elegant human being. And we were stumped. What do we do? On the one hand, he was right. On the other hand, gosh, it really didn't sit well with us.
Right.
But then we had a problem. There's a halachic problem. Are you allowed to go and essentially separate a body? Because the fact is, if he's been buried for 80 years, at that point, 79 years, you're never going to be able to get all of them.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Are you allowed to say? Big question, right?
Right.
Again, I'm not going to go through all the amazing things that happened, but amazing things happened. We consulted essentially with Rabbi Asher Weiss, who was a tremendous, brilliant, insightful, compassionate, wonderful posek, decider of Jewish law in Jerusalem. He was our guide, and many amazing things happened with him that are just too long for this podcast, but really would blow your mind. And ultimately, he said yes. So we said, okay, great. So we wrangled an invitation to go to Berlin to meet General Bakken in his office. And how do you ask this question when he already said no? So here's what we did. Last May, Memorial Day 2023, we had done 3 headstone replacements in Normandy, one in the Normandy American Cemetery, 2 in the Brittany American Cemetery. But we brought all 50 people who came from the United States. We told them the story of Nathan Baskind, which we had just been discovering, and we brought them to the German War Cemetery. And for the first time in 79 years, we said Kaddish, we said Kelmali Rachamim, we davened, we cried, we sang, and there were a whole bunch of kids of Holocaust survivors with us. A lot of them had a great difficulty walking onto this ground. It was really, really an amazing experience. But we had that filmed. And so we did a 3-minute film, about 2 minutes and 15 seconds of that experience of Rabbi Schachter standing on this war grave going, "You are our brother, we'll never forget you, we want to keep you, we want to find you." And then the last 45 seconds was his great niece, Dr. Samantha Baskind, asking the Germans to help find and recover her uncle. And Dirk Bakken just dissolved, said, "That's it, we're going to find him."
Oh my gosh.
And on that moment, he changed his decision. We moved forward, and we were introduced to another extraordinary person. His name is Arn Schrader, who is a malach. He's a malach. And we all worked together to get this done. Then this past December, we actually did the exhumation over 3 days in unbelievable winter conditions. It was the hardest work you can imagine. We went through thousands of, there were 52 soldiers there. The human body has 206 bones. Just do the math, it's thousands and thousands and thousands of bones. And then through amazing circumstances, We had a great laboratory in the United States, Bodhi Technologies, did the DNA analysis. They warned us these conditions are terrible. You need to lower your expectations. This is never going to happen. And wouldn't you know it, we found him. And they were so blown out of the water that we found him that their two chief scientists actually came to the funeral 2 weeks ago
Wow.
at the Normandy
Wow.
American Cemetery because they needed to see this.
Just through
And
bones? Wait, you only had bones there?
it's 80 years. It's all that's left.
Oh my God. Wait, is
How
it the
so?
bone like that they teach us that would never disintegrates?
I'm
What's
sorry?
isn't there like a bone that we're supposed to believe never disintegrates or something? Like that's why the
Maybe.
tefillin, I don't know, maybe that's like a Chabad thing, but anyway.
So just to get an idea of size, how big was the grave site?
Mm.
The grave site was about 30 feet by 20, 25 feet.
So it was a big
It
space.
took a crane to go down about 4.5, 5 feet, and then we hand dug everything else. There was a team of 17 people. There were anthropologists from the University of Marseille, anthropologists that we brought from the United States, anthropologists from Germany, and then there were laborers. There were experts in exhumation. We had translators.
Wow.
And I will tell you, and here's another thing that's mind blowing. I'm an American Orthodox Jewish Zionist.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were completed with our work, we needed to rebury all of these soldiers.
Right. Oh my God.
And I officiated at the funeral of these soldiers. And to think about an out-of-body experience that you
Right.
never imagined in your life, and I was just, intimately involved with these soldiers. I held their bones in my hands. When we found, there was an unexploded hand grenade, which was a trip and a half,
Oh
lots
my
of
God.
bullets and lots of artifacts, but the bones are obviously what affects you. And so I did that, and Arn Schrader did that. He spoke beautifully, and
Wow.
it was really quite an experience.
I want to just
Fast
oh yeah,
forward, we buried him in Normandy, and it
it's
was.
so beautiful.
By the way, and I want to correct something Jay said, but not correct. I want to expand on something you said. It was a full military honors funeral and fully Jewish funeral. I
Wow.
don't think that has happened before in Normandy,
Wow.
and it was absolutely amazing.
That's so nice. I
So
want to give a little one second. I want to give a little
yeah.
context just for people who might not understand something that I know because I grew up Orthodox, so I maybe it means more. I don't know if it means more or whatever, but the context of it is that we believe that a soul is kind of hovering, right? And watching itself, from above and wants to be buried properly, at least in like, especially in Hasidic philosophy and Kabbalah and all of and probably in mainstream Orthodoxy, I'm sure you have the same kind of idea that a soul wants to be buried properly in the right way with all of its parts, with, say with the prayers. So in my mind, I'm picturing that, and maybe it's infantilizing it, but that's how I feel. Like I'm picturing the soldier just the joy that this soul of this soldier has right now, that for 80 years he was probably his soul was suffering, right? I mean, he was not buried properly, he was buried with enemies, like, and now to give him that honor, it's something that you can't. And there's this concept, we talked about it once before, but this idea of chesed shel emes, that it's such an amazing kindness because he can never repay you. He's never going to be able to repay Shalom for what he did, right? Because he's dead, he's gone. And so when you do it for somebody like Nathan, you're doing something, a kindness that you'll never get repaid for. And it's just an ultimate kindness. And I it really gives me chills to think about it,
It makes it really pure. It makes it
Yeah.
really pure. And I don't want to say Shalom. There's so many people involved. I just happen to be
Well,
speaking with you.
whatever. You're
But yeah,
exactly.
but
You're
it's a
representing them.
beautiful thing.
Yeah. So
It's a beautiful thing.
so when I first emailed you, I think it was a couple of days before you were going back to Normandy for the reburial ceremony. Could you? I'm sure you could talk about it for hours, but could you just talk about what the ceremony was like for just a couple of minutes to give everyone a sense of what happened and who was there, and what it was like to be part of that?
Sure, there are 3 ceremonies. The first one was a few weeks before, and we spoke in between these, and it's called the
Okay.
dignified transfer. It's called the dignified transfer of remains. The Germans had custody of Nathan Baskind from June 23, 1944, until about 3 weeks before the funeral. They had to hand him over to the United States. The way that's done is a German honor guard went from Germany, drove to Ramstein Air Force Base, to the chapel at Ramstein Air Force Base, where a U.S. honor guard was waiting. This is just an unbelievable scene. And they literally transfer the remains. There's a script, a very beautiful script about, we're handing over an honored American soldier. It just, you can't help but just weep your eyes out. And then the invocation was given by the base chaplain, the Jewish base chaplain, who is a Lubavitch guy, who's a great friend of mine, Levi
Yeah.
Bakar. He spoke beautifully. And I'll tell you, here's one of those crazy things that kept happening. And again, I'm the Maimonidean rationalist, but here's something that happened that's just nuts. So there's a bugler in the corner, and to hear this single note, the guy was spectacular, young guy, and as soon as the remains are handed over, everybody salutes the remains. It's a whole process, and the bugler starts playing this, taps, and it's this very, beautiful. He's playing it very slowly, and Nathan Baskind grew up in Squirrel Hill
Oh,
in Pittsburgh,
wow.
right?
Yeah.
On
Oh,
a
wow.
little tiny road called Darlington Road, right? So here's a crazy coincidence. He grew up in Darlington Road. My sister-in-law has lived in Squirrel Hill on Darlington Road
Oh my
for
gosh.
38 years,
Oh my
right?
gosh.
Huh.
We have a board member who grew up around the corner on Darlington Road.
Oh my
Okay, it's
gosh.
like crazy. I look up at the bugler, and wouldn't you know what his name is? Darlington.
Oh my gosh.
What are the chances?
My God.
Wow. You're going to be a
Right?
chassid in no time.
So that was ceremony number one. So now we have to get him from Ramstein Air Force Base to in time for the burial on June 23rd. So one of the guys there from the Jewish community, is a lovely master sergeant in the Air Force, says, "I would like to be the shomer to drive him to the base." And the Air Force said yes. And so we arranged it, and he had a shomer
Oh,
the whole way. And then he joined us for Shabbos. We had 72 people came from the United States to be there,
wow.
of which only 3 were members of the family. Everybody else was just there to say thank you to Nathan and to basically apologize for his being alone for 80 years.
Oh.
So then we had a ceremony on Friday, June 21st, at the Marigny German cemetery. Remember, his remains are still there, a bunch of his remains. And we essentially wanted to pay tribute to the Germans who without whom this never could have happened. And I spoke, and Dr. Baskind spoke. Rabbi Schachter, of course, spoke so beautifully. And then the featured speaker, who I will never forget it as long as I live, was General Dirk Bakken, Secretary General of the German War Graves
Wow.
Commission. And he gave a 16-minute oration, which we will reproduce and we will play many, many, many times, on the concept of tshuva, on national and personal tshuva, national and personal repentance. I've never heard anything like it in my life.
Wow.
Never. It was crazy. It was amazing. Then we spent Shabbat together, and on Sunday morning, we got up very, very early in the morning, got to the Normandy American Cemetery, and there was sort of an interesting circumstance. The way burials are done, many Christian burials, but certainly military burials, is you have a lot of sort of the civil religious ceremony, and I mean that in the most respectful, most dignified, most gorgeous way. You have the 3 volley, firearm salute. You have the honor guard, and everyone's perfection, and the folding of the flag, and the whole thing is just simple. It's magnificence. It's magnificence. But because it was a Jewish funeral, what they normally do is people speak, say their prayers, and everybody leaves, and the cemetery workers, the groundskeepers, bury the soldier. That's not a Jewish way to do things.
Right.
And I have to say, the superintendent of the American Battle Monuments Commission, Normandy American Cemetery, Scott Desjardins, is also a great, great, great human being. And he worked with me very hard to make sure this was a fully Jewish ceremony. And for the first time, we were going to invite everybody to earth, dust to dust, to take shovels
Sure.
and to bury Nathan Baskind. It's never been done before.
Wow.
So he was very concerned. So the day before the ceremony, he writes me an email and says, Shalom, do you know how much dirt it takes to fill a grave? He says, this pile is huge. So, of course, when you get there, being that it's Scott Days right and it's military and it's ABMC, these guys are so amazing, there aren't 3 shovels there. There are 3 polished, silver, gorgeous shovels there.
Oh my
And
God.
it's not a pile of dirt. It's dirt that's tapered and beautiful angles. It's perfection. This is the best he could do, but he is terrified that this is, really going to be a fiasco. So we have the whole ceremony. Everything is perfectly Jewish and perfectly military. There was a visiting general there, General Montague, who was there, who spoke magnificently. Everybody was amazing. There was the U.S. consul to France was there, Elizabeth Webster. She's amazing. Anyway, the whole thing was great. Dirk Bakken spoke again, wild.
Wow.
Dr. Samantha Baskind spoke, all great. And then it's time to lower the casket, which was done by Samantha's cousin, who sits there and lowers the casket into the ground. And then we called up 5 people to do the first 5 shovels full of dirt. And then we announced that we're inviting everyone, Jew and Gentile alike, to be part of the final favor of properly burying Nathan Baskind by his friends.
Mm.
And wouldn't you know it, the honor guard broke. And they all went running for shovels. Everybody wanted to participate. The secretary of the ABMC, Charles DeJoux, was there. He wanted to do it. I mean, there was not a single person who did not want to feel the connection with Nathan Baskind. It was palpable. It was so real. And you just knew we were doing something so good, so right, so proper. And I'll never forget it.
Well, I could tell you one thing. Yesterday I was spending my time very wisely scrolling my Instagram and looking at everyone's stories. And I have a friend who's on a Costa Rica cruise, if you know what that is. And they were in Normandy yesterday, and she showed Nathan's grave. Actually, she showed it on her story.
Yep.
She's a big food influencer. And I wrote her a little message, and I'm like, you're not going to believe it, but tomorrow I'm talking to, so it means a lot to people because they're random vacationers and they wanted to go and see it as well. So that was a big.
So I can tell the AACI is also doing a trip to Normandy, and they're going to be going to Barony and be going to visit Nathan Baskind. So what's happened is, think about it, and we do know about the Costa Rica cruise because everybody was posting it. It was the coolest thing. So what happened was he spent 80 years minus 1 week in total anonymity, lost.
Right.
And he's had more visitors in 2 weeks than he has had in 80 years.
It's amazing.
And I can tell you there are 2 million visitors a year to the Normandy American Cemetery. It wouldn't shock me at all if you had 500,000 visitors a year. Every year he'll tell the story of this Jewish American hero.
Wow.
And it's going to be a huge Kiddush for him. Great sanctification of God's name. And it's we could use good news now.
Yes,
and,
we can.
It's a sad story, but with a really, really, really poetic ending.
It's amazing the work you do.
The New York Post article did not do it justice, to say the least. To say the least.
It was a good start. It was a good start.
Yes, it was
a good start.
It was an entree.
It's really hard. You'd have to write a book. I mean, it's
for sure.
We'll do our part to get this out there, so at least we'll get most of the story.
Yeah,
we'll do our part.
Absolutely.
Wow, thank you so much for.
And one other interesting thing I read about this, just to sort of cap it off, is that at Normandy there's a wall of the missing that has 1,500 names on it. And Nathan Baskind was only the 25th name removed from the list.
Wow.
So it doesn't get removed. Let me tell you what happens. It's really special. There's a thing called a rosette ceremony. After the soldier is buried, the family goes to the wall of the missing. There are 1,550 soldiers who've been missing since World War II. And at the end of the name, and there's no religious designation, it's the name, where he's from, what unit he was with. Samantha got to screw into the wall a gold rosette.
Oh.
And there are only 23 of them.
Wow.
So since World War II, only 23 soldiers have been identified. And once that's done, everyone was smiling. And it was sort of strange because it seemed weird to smile, but you just know that, wow, mission accomplished.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that was the final twist. And it was
awesome.
A beautiful, beautiful moment. Yeah, it's called the
Wow.
Rosette Ceremony. It's beautiful.
That's amazing.
So beautiful.
So, so I'm sure everyone listening now wants to learn much more about Operation, not Project Benjamin, Operation Benjamin. So where can they learn more about you? If people want to donate, where should they go? All that kind of stuff.
It's great. So let me just add, and I appreciate the opening. We don't accept money from the families of the descendants of honor. We find it as sort of an ethical issue, and so we
Sure.
don't accept money from them. So we are totally donor supported,
Yes.
and that's how we do this. Our website is operationbenjamin.org, operationbenjamin, one word.org, and it's got a lot of great stuff. If you go to the section Our Heroes, we have a video of every ceremony we've done.
Oh,
Some of them are just stunning. Invite you to view them. They're beautiful and they're very heartwarming. Really, really heartwarming.
wow.
So invite you to go.
It's amazing.
Wow. Thank you so much
Well,
for being here.
yeah, thank you so much for joining us. This was even better than I had hoped for. So
Well,
thanks
thank you. You
for
guys are wonderful. It was great.
thank you so
Thanks a
much,
million,
Shalom.
guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Wait.
Bye.
Okay. I have a question.